Today it's time for another dose of nostalgia bait, with a game that I loved burning hours into during my first few years of university, and that's Dungeon Siege. And judging by the comment sections on a number of videos, a lot of you did this too. So the question is, has it held up over the years, or is it all a bit of rose-tinted glasses? And really, at least after we finished beating the base game on stream, I have to say it's a little bit of both, since I definitely ran into things that I did not remember being quite so jank, like the elevators, but also had my fair share of moments where I found myself wishing new games would learn from it. Though this could also be due to the fact that my fondest memories of Dungeon Siege were in making my own levels and, to a lesser extent, the novelty of the skill system at the time. To summarize it for people who may not have played this in its heyday, the first two Dungeon Siege games basically straddle the line between CRPGs like Baldur's Gate and action RPGs like Diablo. This would be fine in and of itself, but it also delved deep into a rare skill growth system, at least at the time, that basically amounts to practice makes perfect. If you use magic, your intelligence will grow along with your levels in that type of magic you use. If you use axes, your strength will grow along with your melee skill. There are no manually applied stat or skill points, there are no hard classes outside of vague descriptors you earn, there's only you, your party, and how you decide to actually play them. And while Dungeon Siege didn't pioneer this, it was one of the earlier examples that gained popularity in the West. Admittedly, even Final Fantasy had done this well over a decade earlier, but at the time it felt novel since fan translations and emulation had only really started picking up steam for a couple years. And most games that used this were either MMOs or isolated due to those language barriers. Now, as far as the game itself, the story of Dungeon Siege can seem deep or shallow depending on your expectations. If you're expecting depth like Baldur's Gate, it will feel lacking. If you're expecting keystone storytelling like Diablo, then you'll find it will have a bit more than you were expecting. This is because while the majority of the game is delving into combat of various caves, dungeons, wilderness zones, etc., you will find random denizens with their own stories and quests, as well as proper towns with a dozen or so inhabitants. And while these towns will often have quests or even full stories of their own, they will usually be on the simpler side, such as fetching supplies, killing a few monsters nearby, delivering a message, or in the case of the story, just going after the next objective that moves you towards the main quest ending. And if I had to draw a parallel in story complexity, I would put it about on par with Nox, though without the split storyline and a bit less emotional investment from the characters. Now, the simple version of the story is that at one time, a great kingdom existed, then became corrupted and was destroyed by evil. Its survivors, guarded by the 10th Legion, traveled west and founded the kingdom that would be the basis of this story, Ebb. Now, 300 years after those events, we start with you. A simple farmer on the countryside who is forced into action when the bestial Krug attacks, setting off a series of events that see you traveling across Ebb in the hope of saving your home and eventually discovering the source of these maladies. Obviously, things get far more complex than this, as you're introduced to new cities, new conflicts, bandits, imprisoned wizards, dragons, demons, etc. There are calls to arms, optional dungeons, as well as people you need to help along the way. And through all this, you will encounter characters that will join you on your fight, though most will only join you if you can pay their asking price, so sometimes it might just be cheaper to hire a mule. And while that may sound like a joke, this game does actually have a lot of randomized loot like action RPGs of the day, and it does indeed allow you to hire literal mules. And while their combat ability is definitely lacking, they do make up for it by being able to carry an ungodly amount of stuff. That said, unless you're terribly unlucky, you will eventually get access to a spell to convert unwanted loot into gold, albeit one item at a time, so this clogging of inventory is not a huge issue, and generally I would leave the mules alone unless you're doing a solo run or otherwise want to limit your party size. Speaking of a solo run though, there are actually pretty interesting advantages to this, since by giving up the support of other characters, you are centralizing all the experience onto yourself. This is because of that system we mentioned earlier, where you only get experience by doing. So by being the one doing every cast of a spell or every attack, you are getting all the experience yourself. The downside of this type of thing though is, well, you're alone and have no backup, so you can really easily get overwhelmed by enemies, and if you die, there is no one there to resurrect you, which means time to load your last save. That said, it is the dominant strategy for speedruns, even though it still won't give you enough experience to access the strongest spells in the game due to how leveling and scaling works, since those are reserved for the second repeatable campaign that is much easier to farm in. Now, if you go the more normal route of building a party, giving people specific roles, and getting used to the control of your swarm of up to 8 units with all their special abilities or lack thereof, you'll find that the characters will still get up to a decent enough amount of stats and skills to beat the game, and you'll have that safety net of having additional characters, not to mention getting to try out a greater variety of weapons and skills on your playthrough. Generally, where Dungeon Siege falls a bit short, and frankly, similar games like Throne of Darkness do this as well, is that due to straddling the line between CRPG and action RPG, they end up with some weird divergences in complexity. With Dungeon Siege, that's the disparity between physical characters who don't really get any special skills for leveling melee or range attacks, other than just getting better at it. And yeah, while ranged is pretty much stuck with bows, melee does not actually care whether you use axes, maces, staves, shields, whatever, while spells themselves actually get a wide variety of functionality across multiple skills and provide some of the most important and powerful buffs in the game. This will result in a few things happening, but simply put, it will result in you pretty much playing fire and forget with some characters, and ultimately having to spend a significant amount of your time micromanaging others. This can be a pro or con depending on your playstyle, but with the lack of detailed character control systems like we had in, say, Baldur's Gate, it does become a necessity to usually set up the majority of your team to be those more simple and less interesting setups. The other big flaw in the balance of Dungeon Siege that people will notice is the price of items and hiring new characters, with the balance of gold generated and the cost of worthwhile items being somewhat out of whack, especially if you're wanting to save money for growing your team later. This stands especially true with items like spellbooks that can get ungodly expensive and are extremely rare to come across in forms other than the basic buffless book in the wild. Needless to say, it absolutely feels like the currency system was designed around the much more grind mindset of the second campaign rather than the playthrough mindset of the first campaign. Or simply put, it feels like the money system was designed for the multiplayer map and then ported to the single player campaign, rather than vice versa. So for the campaign playthrough, you will generally not be using the best gear available, but rather just working with what you can scavenge. It's worth noting at this point that getting the expansion or even just the multiplayer campaign up and running will require some fiddling beyond the normal amount to get the game to run. This is true of both the GOG and Steam versions of the game, though there are at least step-by-step guides out there just for this, and can change or even improve your experience by giving you the ability to try even more and possibly even adjusting the difficulty of the game more. This, combined with the surprisingly still alive mod and custom campaign scene, means the experience can be refined much further from vanilla to fix the major issues I mentioned and will mention. Now, ignoring the mods, the reason I did this on vanilla rather than with, say, the expansion setup through one of the guides is because the expansion actually changes a number of the mechanics, which drastically changes the difficulty of the core game. Not quite making it a new game, but it does greatly shift the difficulty, since it becomes balanced for the expansion content without updating the core game content. This is definitely one of the pieces of jank I mentioned earlier, as well as the hotkey system being focused on the loadout selections, which can take some getting used to and basically serve as your more kludgy alternative to systems like the AI system used in other games of the time. So instead of having conditions for your ally to use a skill, attack, etc., you're basically setting them into a stance and then using hotkeys to change your entire team's loadouts to prioritize different skills. The other big piece of jank also sticks around the control scheme, and that is how unfortunately awful it is to control your party in tight spaces, and specifically, elevators are a nightmare to navigate since positioning them all in a small square can be fiddly. While there is thankfully a mod for this, the base game actually still feels rough since a lot of elevators are either ambushes or the escape from ambushes, so it's not uncommon for your party to get split while fighting and ultimately get wrecked by these small platforms. But really, with games involving larger groups of characters, this is not an uncommon issue even with today's games. It was just extra pronounced here due to the real-time nature of the combat and the less refined command system for the units. And when you add in summons and such to the formula, it can even get a bit more chaotic. And yes, this game has summons. In fact, its magic system is fairly well developed, with both of its combat and nature magic each getting several dozen spells, each of varying power, with a total well into the hundreds, with both getting unique heals, damage spells, buffs, summons, etc. And while there is overlap in functionality, they still keep their individual flavors, since nature tends to have the stronger support spells and combat tends to have stronger offensive spells, with both having an interesting variety of summons as well, and enough overlap that you could focus on one tree or the other and still be efficient enough to beat the game. Another nice thing is that the spells, at least to an extent, actually level with your skill level in their respective magic types. So a person who barely uses nature magic will only heal a little bit with the basic healing spell, while a person with high levels of nature magic will heal quite a bit. Now, admittedly, the highest level spells will require upwards of 100 levels in a given magic type, while the base campaign will only get you into the 40s or 50s if you have a full party, and only a bit higher if you go solo. But it will still have an enjoyable enough variety for each tree to be interesting. Between these systems, as well as positioning, puzzle solving, exploring mazes, etc., I actually still had a lot of fun with this game, and I really do wish the practice makes perfect style skill system would get a bit more love, even if most implementations of it have been janky or mediocre up to date. Though I think overall, due to it trying to straddle two genres awkwardly, it does not quite hold up as well to modern scrutiny as some of the other nostalgia bait games we've covered. So really, I'd mostly recommend this to people interested in game design and who might want to take the ideas presented further, while learning why some aspects felt like shortcomings, especially in the story and control departments. Needless to say, I do really still enjoy the game, but I would say this one is definitely more because of the nostalgia for me than actual quality of the title, even though it does have that strong historical value. Compared to most other games in the space, the really standout feature for me was mostly the skill system, and it is absolutely a gap in the market ripe for new games to show up in.